Bye weeks have arrived and they've brought with them injuries and some injury returns. We'll talk about all the starts and sits for your week 5 fantasy leagues on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down and the Week 5 Start Sit Show, where we take you through all the big start sit decisions for the week. Now, as always, you can always leave your comments below and I'll answer all your questions, or you can hit me up on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and our website, which has all of our rankings, is ffdfantasyfootball.com. You can also check out my articles over at football.rasball.com, and it'll be great if you'd like and subscribe on YouTube as well. Today, though, we're talking start sits for every single position, so let's get straight into it so it doesn't run too long. I've got places to go and people to see. Who am I kidding? I've got more fantasy football stuff to do, but still got to make time for that. And they're starting off with the quarterbacks. And if you haven't seen the show before, green means they have a good matchup and red means they have a bad matchup. Basically, if they've got a top 10 matchup according to points allowed so far this season, they're green. They got a bottom 10 matchup according to points allowed, they're red. It doesn't always work out exactly that way, but that's roughly what we're looking at here. And unsurprisingly, Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson still the top two. With Khalil Shakir out now, and I made these rankings before I knew Khalil Shakir was definitely out, maybe we'd have Lamar Jackson higher, but realistically, they're still top two, and pretty much nobody's got both of them. So if you do have both, maybe ease towards Jackson, but see how you go. Jaden Daniels gets a tough matchup, but with his style and his running style, I still think he's going to score plenty of points, so he's a safe option for me. Jordan Love and Brock Purdy make the big jump up the charts. Jordan Love was fantastic last week, despite everything happening. He gets the Rams, who are really banged up, and now the Packers are banged up as well. They're missing a heap of wide receiver options. Romeo Dobbs is now out, so it's a little bit iffy, but I still think that they've got well and truly enough. They're also missing Christian Watson as well, of course. So, look, they're going to have some issues there, but they've got enough players to cover. I still think Love's going to be absolutely fine. And Brock Purdy, with everyone back against the Cardinals and what should be another high-scoring game, I think he's going to be fine. Joe Burrow, I really like this week as well. I really considered moving him even higher than that against Baltimore. That should be a real shootout. There's just no guarantees with him, of course, but I do feel like he's got plenty of upside, just maybe not quite as much as Love and Purdy. CJ Stroud versus Justin Fields is a decision apparently a lot of people are making, because I've been messaged that several times today already. I do have Stroud slightly higher. He's not the greatest matchup against Buffalo. They do allow a lot of running, but I mean, Houston's down to their third string running back, and it is Cam Akers who's solid, but I don't see them really truly leaning on him. I also think they're going to be trailing probably, or at least it's going to be a very close game. So they're going to need Stroud to go well to get some points. Justin Fields against the Cowboys. The Steelers are favorites, which I find really interesting. I would have imagined the Cowboys would be, but that's not the way the bookmakers have it, and I have to trust that. So I do think Fields is going to have to score some points. Can he break down this Cowboys defense, or is it going to be a lot of running? Because you can run on the Cowboys as well. Is it going to be Fields doing the running? Is it going to be Najee Harris? We don't really know, but I've got Stroud slightly ahead of Fields for that reason, especially in a 5 or 6 point passing touchdown league, I should say. Stroud's definitely high, but Fields is a bit higher in a 4-point passing touchdown league, but still behind Stroud. Geno Smith sides in at number 9. It's kind of hard to see how that game is going to go. It could be very run heavy, but I do think that Smith's ultimately going to score enough points to make it work. You can throw to the outside receivers against the Giants. And Kyler Murray, way lower than where we usually see him, but I do feel like they might struggle a little bit against the 49ers. So I've moved him down a little bit. I do think there's an argument, and I might even move him up later on to have him ahead of Geno Smith and maybe even Justin Fields. But I don't know. It's really hard to really, truly trust him in that matchup. Now, some lower down guys. Baker Mayfield obviously had a solid game as expected. Kirk Cousins, look, I wanted to have him higher this week. I hadn't seen it yet. He was pretty average through the first 4 weeks because he had tough matchups. He finally popped off on Thursday Night Football. I'm so happy about that because he was one of the guys I was very high on during the preseason. I believe I ranked him in the top 10 at times. So, of got him in plenty of leagues, and so that really helped me on the weekend. On Thursday. I hope it did for you as well. Obviously, he'll be ranked a lot higher moving forward because we've now actually seen it happen and seen that they're willing to do that. Patrick Mahomes way lower than we've ever seen him before. No Rashee Rice badly hurts. No Marquise Brown, obviously, as well. I do think we're going to see more Kelsey and Noah Gray. But besides that, wide receivers, is Xavier Worthy really a true wide receiver one? I don't think so. It's not exactly going to be Juju or Justin Watson stepping into that role. So what's going to happen here? I think they probably just grind out a win somehow because that's what my Chiefs do. I don't really want him in fantasy, though. Anthony Richardson gets a good matchup against Jacksonville, but he's banged up. We don't even know if he's going to start. If Joe Flacco starts, arguably, I'd probably even have him higher than I've got Richardson there. I think he might even be up into the 12 spot ahead of Mahomes. We know that he will air it out, and he's a really good quarterback. He really should be a starter in the league. I don't know how he keeps getting these backup jobs instead of just being trusted with the outright job. There's a couple of places that really should just be using him. Regardless, Anthony Richardson's still an okay option given such a tough matchup. Given such a good matchup, I should say. Trevor Lawrence and Deshaun Watson in the same category against the Colts and the Commanders. They're great matchups for quarterbacks who have been struggling a little bit despite having good pass catching options. Dak obviously moves down because it's hard to pass on the Steelers, and Brandon Cooks is out, and Sam Darnold moves out because it's so hard to pass on the Jets. And he even struggled in the second half last week against the Packers. So while he has been good, while he's won 4 straight games, while he has at least 2 touchdowns in every game, finally gets a truly tough matchup against the likes of Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed. Don't know that you can really trust him despite Jordan Addison finally being back. So he's lower for me, but he does still have the potential to have a solid game. Caleb Williams gets a good matchup against Carolina, but I do think they might potentially just run a lot. They go into that game favorites, which has been rare for them. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. Andy Dalton's a little bit lower because it is hard to pass on the Bears. That could be a very run-heavy game in general, which would mean the game's going to be over very quickly. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. Other than that, no one that's particularly of interest there. Running backs, and Jordan Mason finally gets up to the top there. Gets a fantastic matchup against the Cardinals. They've conceded, I believe, the 5th most points against running backs so far this season. Yep, that's right. 5th most points against running backs this season. So excellent situation for him. Derrick Henry popped off last week and gets a good matchup against the Bengals in what should be a high-scoring game. I would expect a touchdown or 2 from him, maybe some solid yardage as well. If they can keep it on the ground because they're ahead, they definitely will. Kyren Williams against the Packers. I mean, we've seen that they can get involved in some pretty high-scoring games. They are not the easiest matchup on the ground, but Williams remains their number 1 weapon, realistically. Kenneth Walker way higher than he will be most weeks because the Giants are the kind of team you can run on, and they're using Walker so much in the red zone that when in this situation we'd expect them to score quite a bit, and it's not easy to target them target them around the middle of the field. It could be Walker a lot if they find out how to cover those outside receivers. I just think that his scoring upside is so high, realistically. Alvin Kamara gets a tough matchup against the Chiefs. He's a bit lower for me, plus he's a little bit banged up. I expect him to play, but it might be a little bit limited, which is why he's a bit lower. Aaron Jones also has that matchup against the Jets. Look, this should still be a solid situation for him, but the Jets have been so good defensively against the run and the pass. Last season, you could target them on the ground, and they conceded the 7th most points against running back. This season, they've been tough to pass on, and they've been tough to run on. Having said that, they've also had matchups that have been very low scoring and when neither team's really moving the ball. So it is possible that the Vikings show you can actually move the ball on the Jets. I do think Jones is going to be heavily involved in both the pass game and the run game because that is one way you can target the Jets. So for that reason, I've got him ranked quite high. Chuba Hubbard, way higher than I'll ever have him again, probably. I do think they're just going to run as much as possible on the Bears. That is how you can attack them. Breece Hall, lower than you would usually see him. They're limiting his touches a bit, but I don't think they're going to limit it every week. I think it's just because they've played so many snaps the last couple of weeks. I think the last couple of weeks, they have played 73 and 74 snaps, which is pretty high for the Jets. Usually they play around 50 or 60 snaps because they don't have the best pace of game. For that reason, they started to bring Hall off and use a lot more Braylon Allen the last couple of weeks in more neutral situations when the game wasn't out of hand in either direction. I don't think that's going to keep happening, but I do think it's very difficult to run on the Vikings. They've conceded the 4th fewest points against running backs this season, probably partly because they've been winning most of the time, but also because it is difficult to move the ball on the ground against them. So for that reason, Breece Hall is a little bit lower. I just don't really trust him in this situation. James Cook, really hard to trust him as well. He hasn't been great the last couple of weeks, hasn't really been getting the touches that we expect. But he's still ultimately with a good team in a high scoring game, despite the fact he's only had 20 carries in the last 2 weeks combined. I do still think that he is their main guy. It's not like they're using a whole lot more Ray Davis or anything. They just kind of struggled to move the ball last week. Then they were behind early against the Ravens. I do think that he probably gets back to being a solid option. Josh Jacobs higher than usual because, again, you can score on the Rams. The Rams have conceded the 6th most points against running backs and against wide receivers and against tight ends. And I already said they're top 5 against quarterbacks. You can just score against them in any way. In fact, they're the 8th most points conceded against DSTs as well. It's really only kickers that have bad games against Rams because you can score against them at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see if that continues happening or if that's been more matchup based. I do think that Josh Jacobs has a real chance to rebound. We saw when they had a good game a couple of weeks ago. He was excellent. He scored a lot of points. He had like 30 carries as well, which really helped. So I do think that if they do that again, because they've got a solid lead and they haven't had enough solid leads this season, that we could see Jacobs be very productive. So your buy low probably opportunity on Josh Jacobs might be right now. It is, of course, potentially a very temporary situation. But yeah, against the Colts, 32 carries for 151 yards after going for 84 yards in week 1. So while he has struggled the last couple of weeks, I do still think he is a good, solid option. Some people have him even higher than that, but I do realize that Emmanuel Wilson is going to be involved. Najee Harris way higher than usual because there's no Jalen Warren and there is no Cordarrelle Patterson. And I don't think Aaron Shampkin is going to come in and take a lot of touches. I definitely pronounced his name wrong. I don't think I've ever said it before in my life. Brian Robinson Jr. gets a tough matchup and Austin Eckler's back. I might have him a little bit too high, honestly. I'm tempted to move him down. It's just that Connor against the 49ers, I don't fully trust. I just worry it gets out of hand early, and then there's a whole heap of Trey Benson at the end and a whole heap of passing down stuff with Demicado. So that's why I don't have Connor higher than that, but I could arguably move him above Robinson, and I've considered it. DeAndre Swift gets that great matchup against the Panthers. The problem is he's not getting the goal line touches. And until that happens, I really can't rank him too high because his touchdown upside is so low. So Swift is in there, but so is Roschon Johnson. I've ranked him 29th. I would have him even higher, but I'm not fully convinced that he's definitely the goal line guy. It might still be Khalil Herbert. They only had one goal line run last week, so we don't know for sure what's going on. But if it is Johnson, then Johnson's going to be excellent, and you can move him a lot higher than that. Achane will suffer with Raheem Mostert presumably being back. I've moved him that low, and I would arguably move him lower if it wasn't a situation where it feels like they're going to need to run the ball, and you'll still see a lot of Achane. Ford gets a solid matchup against the Commanders. They're probably going to have to throw it a lot, but when they are trailing, you do see more Ford than Foreman, who's on there a lot more when they're winning. So for that reason, I do think Ford will be more heavily involved than he usually would. It's a bit of a concern that Pierre Strong might be back, but I still think Ford's a good option. Trey Sermon, I want to have higher, and I arguably might move him higher, and arguably should have him higher. He takes on Jacksonville. You can score points on Jacksonville. Everyone scores points on Jacksonville. They've considered the most points against quarterbacks and the 5th most against wide receivers and the 7th most against running backs. So everybody can score on Jacksonville. The Colts should be involved. And the Colts are, I believe, underdogs in that game, which seems absolutely wild given how easy it is to score on Jaguars. But I guess the Colts have their own situation as well. So Trey Sermon is the guy for me. We've seen him be effective in the past when he has deputized for Jonathan Taylor. Last season when Taylor and Zach Moss were both out in week 15, he took on the Steelers, and I think he had 17 carries for 88 yards or something like that. And that's not an easy team to run on. So I do think that he has a solid matchup here. Speaking of Zach Moss, he takes on the Ravens. That's a tough matchup, but I still like him better than Chase Brown because he's getting used on 3rd downs and 2-minute drills, and they're still splitting it on every other down. So you'd expect there's going to be a lot more passing downs to the running backs this week against the Ravens. So for that reason, Moss is higher than Brown, even though I think in a game they're winning, it'll be a lot closer to an even split. Kareem Hunt is my top Chiefs player. You can run on the Saints. It's not easy, but you can do it. It's certainly easier to attack them that way than through the air. So I do think that we could see Hunt be okay. I expect he's probably the goal line back. While Pirine did get the carry last game, it was very late in the game. He was out there as kind of like a passing back on I think it was a 2-minute drill even. I think that might explain why that's happened. Carson Steele actually played most of the first quarter in that game before fumbling, and then Hunt took over. So there's no guarantee that Hunt's definitely the guy. They might give Steele another crack, or potentially Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who's potentially back, comes in and all of a sudden he's heavily involved. So it's messy, but there's no really that many great options below him. Javonte Williams is arguably a solid option, but he's still splitting with Jaleel McLaughlin. He is the main guy. He's going to do more of the passing down work. They finally gave him a good amount of carries last week. I believe it was 16 off the top of my head, which is pretty darn solid. It was 16, along with 3 receptions. So that's a solid workload. I do think it's possible he gets that again, but he hasn't done much with it at times this season. Surprising to have Antonio Gibson up there. If you haven't had your head to the ground, that's because Gibson is supposedly going to start ahead of Ramondre Stevenson this week. Now, starting does not mean taking his role. It's entirely possible they give Gibson the first drive, then give Stevenson the second drive, and then play the hot hand. So it's not a guarantee, but I do think that Gibson has more chance of scoring points than Stevenson does this week. I've ranked him higher. It's a good matchup against the Dolphins. You definitely can run on the Dolphins, and teams often do, because it's hard to pass on them, and you're usually ahead against them at the moment. They've conceded the 4th most points to running backs and the 3rd fewest points against quarterbacks. And it's not like Jacoby Brissett's going to do a lot against them. So I do think we see a lot of Antonio Gibson. The Patriots are shockingly favorites in this game, which has an over-under of 36.5 points. It's going to be ugly out there, but I do think we see a lot of Gibson and still a reasonable amount of Stevenson as well. Alexander Mattison also up there because Zamir White is out. Hard to know who he's going to split with. I think probably Abdullah, but it is possible Dylan Lowry gets involved. We also saw Tyreek McAllister out there last week a little bit. Not sure what's going on with that, but I do expect that Mattison will be the main guy. Against Denver, they are underdogs, but I still think he's going to get a solid workload. Tyrone Tracy is in there because of a groin injury to Devin Singletary. We've seen Singletary struggle a little bit this season, but still go okay in some games. Tracy now becomes the guy, and I suspect Eric Gray is going to be involved as his backup. It's hard to trust a guy who's never started before, but he should get an okay workload. The problem is they are underdogs against Seattle. We haven't really seen Seattle take on a really strong opposition and succeed yet this season, but they are 6.5-point favorites this week. You can run on Seattle. They conceded the 2nd most yards to running backs last season and the most touchdowns to running back last season. Now, to be fair, they have been a lot better this season, but we did see that turn around a little bit last week, which is why they have now conceded the 13th most points to running backs when they were towards the bottom going into last week's game. So I do think that because of their matchups, they're a bit lower than they actually should be, and this is still a solid matchup for Tracy. K-Makers I would like to put higher. You can definitely run on Buffalo, but whether they give it to Akers or a good Bawale, whether they actually run or just decide they're going to pass anyway because they're behind or because they can, I don't know. But we saw what Derrick Henry could do. So there's definitely a massive amount of upside there. I think everyone from about 22 to 27 has a heap of upside, except White, who's obviously already played. Maybe not so much Madison, but he could still get a lot of touches. So they're all very interesting, and they might well shift around before the games on Sunday. So feel free to check in with me on Sunday morning if you've got questions, or alternatively, you can also hit me up on any of those social medias I mentioned earlier. Roche, I'll also be on the Walter Football Show on Saturday evening as well. So you can hit me up live for actual verbalized answers to those questions on there as well. I mentioned Roshan Johnson earlier. Rico Dowdle just has that tough matchup against Pittsburgh. I do think he is the clear starter now. I saw that coming a mile away. I was talking about him a heap in the offseason. I just wish they could run the ball better. If only we had the old Cowboys and all of a sudden Dowdle would be winning me a heap of leagues. I talked about Stevenson and Mostert earlier. I talked about Chase Brown. Algier has obviously already played. Justice Hill against the Bengals, he tends to play a little bit better when they are behind. Having said that, he had a big game last week because they just ran so much they couldn't use Henry the whole time. They needed to use a bit of Hill. It is possible that happens this game, but I think it's less likely. Eckler comes back, gets a tough matchup, but arguably still a solid option. Guys like Braylon Allen, anyone from there down, they're essentially backups, but they are getting a little bit of volume. Guys like Allen, Charbonnet is doing a lot of receiving work. Emmanuel Wilson's nearly splitting with Jacobs, but I think it'll be mostly Jacobs this week. We've seen some Bigsby some weeks. P. Ryan gets in some good situations. So there's plenty of guys there that are still kind of like desperation flex starters, but there's nothing to really talk about. Wide receivers, and there's CeeDee Lamb up the top once again, as he so often is against Pittsburgh. That is not an easy matchup, but using the slot versus wide tool, which I recommend you use on the Razzball website, they've got some awesome tools: slot versus wide, start sit assistant tools on like win loss, so how a player goes when they're winning or losing, if you expect them to be an easy winner or loser, or alternatively home and away splits, how they go when they're home and away. Well, Lamb is obviously mostly a slot receiver. He takes on Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh do concede a lot more points through the slot than out wide. So it's still a solid matchup for him, even though it's traditionally difficult to pass on Pittsburgh. Jamar Chase gets a fantastic matchup against the Ravens. You can definitely score through the air against the Ravens. They have conceded over 20 points a game just to out wide receivers so far this season. I do think Chase probably has a good game. DK Metcalf, I don't think I've ever had him this high. I already talked about how much you can target the Giants out wide. They're very difficult to face in the slot, but they have conceded, I believe, the second most points behind LA to out wide receivers so far this season. So this is a fantastic matchup for Metcalf. Technically also a good matchup for Lockett, but he's not playing every down. Nico Collins gets that really tough matchup against Buffalo. It is really hard to pass on Buffalo, partly because it's so easy to run on them, and secondly because they're so strong at shutting down out wide. They do have a little bit of a slot funnel defense as well, which isn't going to help Collins. Having said that, he's been nearly matchup proof so far this season. A lot of people have him ranked second and third. I'm actually low on him there, which seems a little bit crazy. He and Jefferson, I'm both low on. It's just hard for me to trust them in those matchups. Jefferson will probably get moved to the slot a bit because you can definitely target the Jets in the slot. They've got Reed and Gardner out wide. In fact, they've conceded more points to slot receivers than to out wide receivers so far this season, which is wild because you've traditionally got two out wide receivers and one slot receiver on the field at one time. So you essentially have twice the chance of getting it to the out wide receiver. That's not how it always works, but it can go in that direction. So it is a bit surprising. I do think he's still going to be okay. You still have to start him. Deebo Samuel has been the better player for the 49ers. He's just been way above Ayuk. Now, it is possible that changes around against the Cardinals, but for me, Samuel's a guy you have to start. Jaden Reed takes on the Rams. I talked about how good you can be against the Rams. They concede points to everybody. The one place they don't really concede points is slot receivers, which is Jaden Reed. So that's a little bit concerning. Having said that, I do think that you still need to absolutely start Jaden Reed just because they use him so much when he's out there. And he's only ever out there on 11 personnel. He's not out there most of the time. I think in the last couple of weeks, his snap counts have been surprisingly low. He played 59 snaps last week out of the 76 they played because they played a lot of 11 personnel. But in previous weeks, there were weeks where he played 39 out of 70 snaps, 36 out of 63 snaps, 49 out of 67 snaps. So they're just not really using him. And he's in the slot 84% of the time, according to PFF. So is he someone that you can really trust? I think you still kind of have to, especially given they really only have Wicks and then guys like Bo Melton and Malik Heath. So that's kind of why that I'm still going to trust him, even though I don't particularly want to. Wicks also spends a lot of time in the slot, 44% of his time in the slot. So it is possible that we will still see Reed cycle out wide more than you would usually expect. But I feel just a little bit uncomfortable about him there. Same thing with Amari Cooper. It's kind of hard to trust him. He had that one big boom game and then should have been better last week, but he was dropping catches. Deshaun Watson wasn't finding him. There were opportunities there they couldn't take advantage of. But he faces the Commanders, and that's just such a fantastic matchup. They've conceded the most points against wide receivers this season. They've conceded the 6th most points to out wide receivers and the 3rd most points to slot receivers. You can target them everywhere, and that means you will see a lot of passing against the Commanders. So I do think that Amari Cooper is a fantastic play this week. I've got him ranked way higher than everyone else. I believe consensus is like 18. So I think I'm the highest person on the whole Fantasy Pro side of the 200 experts on there on Amari Cooper. So taking a little bit of a risk there after I dropped a little bit. I think I'm 9th as a wide receiver ranker after this week. Got to get back up into that top 5. Deontay Johnson doesn't have the greatest matchup, but they've targeted him so much. The last couple of weeks, he's got an insane amount of targets. I believe he had 13 targets each of the last 2 weeks. The Fantasy Bros website has 14, but I believe he actually has 13. I think one was a throwaway. But that's insane. That's 26 targets in 2 weeks. If he can get anything near there, he's going to pay off handsomely. Marvin Harrison Jr. way lower than he usually would be. He just makes big plays, and it's kind of hard to do that against the 49ers. That used to be a lot easier, but they've been a little bit better this season. It's still kind of like a neutral matchup to me. But certainly it's not the matchup it used to be. You tend to target them through the slot this season. That can be a little bit fluky, but it's not exactly where we've seen Harrison used. He's more been an out wide downfield receiver, and the 49ers have been better at that this season. Garrett Wilson technically gets a good matchup, but it's so hard to trust him at the moment. Having said that, I think you still have to start him. Same thing with Olave. Got to start him. Stephon Diggs in that tough matchup against the Bills slot. The Bills are very good against slot receivers. In fact, they're very good against receivers in general. So for that reason, it's hard to trust them. If you're going to target anyone against the Bills, admittedly, it is the slot. But I believe Teron Johnson's back, so that's going to hurt that as well. You still have to start Diggs, though. A heap of guys with good matchup. Dontavian Wicks all of a sudden gets every snap after Christian Watson got injured. He should be fantastic against the easy to score on Rams, 6th most points conceded against wide receivers. T. Higgins gets Baltimore. Again, a great matchup. All he needs is a touchdown, and all of a sudden he's going to look fantastic. He had like 10 targets last week. Michael Pittman, with Joe Flacco playing, is ranked there. When I did these wide receiver rankings, I just had a feeling that it would be Flacco. That wasn't the case when I did the quarterback rankings, which was a day earlier. That's why I've kind of got that lack of continuity between those rankings. But this is with Flacco as quarterback. Obviously, if Flacco doesn't play and it's Richardson, well, if Richardson does play, Pittman will drop a little bit. I think probably down to 23 or 24. He's still a very good start. We saw how much they targeted him with Flacco, and they're even starting to target him with Richardson before Richardson got injured. This is a great matchup against the Jags. And with no Jonathan Taylor, I do think they pass more. Zay Flowers is very hard to trust at the moment, but against the Bengals, I feel like they might use him a little bit. Brandon Ayuk, again, just struggling this season on the struggle bus, but he's got so much talent that I can't rank him any lower. Brian Thomas Jr.'s guy I want a little bit higher. It is possible I move him up as high as 20. Gets a great matchup against the Colts. He's their main outside receiver, and you can definitely target the Colts out wide. That is where they concede most of their points. They concede a lot of points in general to wide receivers, but especially to out wide wide receivers. DJ Moore against the Panthers, you can definitely target the Panthers out wide as well. Definitely more so than the slot. But I don't know, do you want to trust DJ Moore this week? He hasn't really been great of late. He did score that touchdown, but I don't know that I fully trust him. That's why I've got him lower than a lot of those other guys. Terry McLaurin finally started to look good the last week or two. He gets the Browns. That's a tough matchup, but if you're going to play the Browns, ideally, you wanted to face the Browns as an out wide receiver, and that's what he is. So it is possible that he'll get some big plays. He's just so hard to trust at the moment. He was very poor, of course, for a while, but finally started to get some targets last week, 10 targets last week. He was getting targets before, they just weren't really hitting. It is possible it finally starts to click for him. Tyreek Hill, I can't rank him lower. He's Tyreek Hill. Jerry Jeudy gets that fantastic matchup I talked about against Washington. I'm way higher on him than anybody else is, so that's why Judy's in there. Shaheed, I don't know. It's against the Chiefs. I can't really trust him. Wan'Dale Robinson's so high because there's no Malik Neighbors this week. It's not a great matchup. You don't really want to be a slot receiver against the Seahawks. They are so good at shutting down slot receivers, but I think they probably move Robinson around a little bit more this week. He has had a massive amount of targets of late, and in future, I'm going to really love him in PPR. He's had the last 4 games, so only 4 games this season, 7 targets the first week, which is okay. Then 17 targets on 29 routes, which is insane. He's getting a target well over half the routes he ran. Then after that, it was 12 targets plus 2 carries, and then 15 targets plus 1 carry. So he is getting a lot of the ball. They are going to use him, even though it's a tough matchup. Xavier Worthy, I know I talked about him technically being the wide receiver 1. I just don't trust his usage. Until I see it, I'm not interested. I know we kind of just tend to try to shuffle everyone up the depth chart and go, well, if you were the wide receiver 2 and now you're the wide receiver 1, you should get that wide receiver 1 like production. Doesn't work like that. Worthy is not that type of player. He's more that big play kind of guy. He's not an alpha receiver. Until we see it, I can't trust that as being the case. So for that reason, I still got Worthy ranked down here. Jackson Smith and Najee were also way lower because it is hard to target the Giants through the slot. You generally get them out wide and through the run game. So I don't think he's going to have as big a game as he did last week. He's definitely had some smaller games and some bigger games. I think this could be one of those smaller games like the one where he only had like 30 yards against Miami. Christian Kirk takes on the Colts. Again, he had a great game last week because he had a great matchup. That was a great slot matchup. This is not. This is an okay slot matchup now that Kenny Moore is out, but I'm not willing to rank him any higher than this. Sutton, again, has had some okay games, but he's hard to trust. The Rams have a great matchup against the Packers. It is really easy to target the Packers through the air, especially out wide, and that is where Tutu Atwell typically plays. Having said that, can you really trust him? He was finally an every down receiver last week, but I don't know. They just don't seem to use their wide receivers in a consistent manner. Their snap counts seem to move all over the place. Jordan Whittington had the most snaps last week, after in week 3 being like the 4th most snaps wide receiver. So it's very hard to trust. I do think Whittington, even though he's a slot guy, could also be an okay desperation start. Myers is the wide receiver 1 with Devontae Adams out against Denver. That's not a great situation, but he is their real only true option. Trey Tucker's really the only other guy you could use, but he's not even out there consistently. They're not using their third guy, DJ Turner, because they're playing a lot of 12 personnel. I think this is going to be real ugly by the Raiders. I don't really want any of them. Josh Downs is back, and he looked good last week. He gets that great matchup against Jaguars. Xavier Legette, love that guy. I talk about it every single week, but he gets a tough matchup, so I'm not willing to move him any higher. Only other interesting guys in there, Tank Dell, tough matchup against the Bills, not playing enough snaps, coming back from injury. I don't trust him. I talked about Tucker just a second ago. He doesn't have a red matchup because he's out wide as opposed to Myers, who's in the slot. Adunze, it's technically a solid matchup, but I don't really trust his usage and the way it's going to work. I don't know. He was poor last week, and I feel burnt. Jennings, obviously, now that Ayuk and Debo are back, you can't really use him. Jordan Addison, again, coming back against the Jets in a tough matchup, not willing to use him. Alan Lazard, though, gets Minnesota. You can definitely attack them through the slot. I think that's a good matchup for him. He's a solid desperation option for me, especially in PPR. Jalen Waddle, hopefully this is the lowest we ever see Jalen Waddle, but with no good quarterback, he's just not used at all. And Jalen Tolbert's up there because Brandon Cooks is injured. Let's talk tight ends. We are starting to see that the tight end matchup things are a little bit easier to read at the moment. Earlier in the season, it seemed really random, but they've kind of stabilized a bit. So there's a lot more red and green in here because it's kind of becoming clearer what's a good matchup and what's a bad matchup. Travis Kelce, I said last season, he's too good to stop, but he seemed to be getting stopped consistently. Well, he finally started to get the targets he deserves, and I expect him to get a lot more with Rashee Rice out. I think that was part of what happened last week. I expect him to be finally the number 1 pass-catching option in this offense, and you'll see a little bit of Noah Gray as well, but I don't want to start Gray. Jake Ferguson, again, will get a lot of targets because Brandon Cooks is out, so it's going to be Lamb and Ferguson. Plus, you can kind of target the Steelers from the slot, which is kind of like a tight end situation. Trey McBride, solid situation, will get a lot of targets against the 49ers. Even though it's a slightly tough matchup, you can generally target them in the middle of the field there. They have been good against tight ends so far this season, but they've been good against everybody. So I do feel like that's a situation where McBride could still thrive. George Kittle is not a guarantee to play. Because he plays later on, it's a little bit harder to trust him. He's in that later slate. So just keep that in mind when selecting him. If you have he and, a Bowers or a Kincaid potentially, you might want to start them instead if you haven't heard that Kittle's probably playing. Bowers has struggled the last couple of weeks, but I do think he should still be solid in that matchup. Kincaid's not getting enough snaps, but he's still more of a focal point in this offense, especially with Khalil Shakir out, than anybody else below him. David Njoku's hopefully back in that big high-scoring matchup against the Commanders. Can you trust him? No. Can you trust anyone below him? No. So for that reason, I'm still selecting Njoku. It is hard to be a tight end against the Commanders, but I do feel like he could still be involved in the scoring in that high-scoring matchup. Tucker Kraft is someone a lot of people are loving. I've got him ranked relatively high against the Rams in that high-scoring game. They've conceded the 6th most points to tight ends because they're conceding points to everybody. The problem is they don't use Kraft very much when they're winning. They tend to only use Kraft when they're trailing, and they should be winning against the Rams. Having said that, we haven't got a very big sample size on that, and when they've been winning, they've had Malik Willis, who has passed the Kraft a lot, but Kraft didn't run a lot of routes in those games because they were mostly running the ball with Josh Jacobs with those 30-something carries we talked about earlier this video. So for that reason, Kraft is a question mark for me, but I'm still willing to give him a go. Evan Ingram, another question mark. It gets a great matchup against the Colts. Pat Freiermuth, that is a tough matchup against the Cowboys. I don't really trust him. He's not running enough routes. Even last week when he had a good game, still wasn't really running enough routes. I believe he ran 30 odd routes, but the previous 2 weeks had run 50 combined. So it's really hard to trust a guy who's not out there for at least 30 routes every single week. He is building, but I'm not really confident on it yet. Lower down guys, for some reason, no bad matchups down here. Don't know why. Pitts finally broke out. That was great to see, but he's still hard to trust. Colby Parkinson gets a good game against the Packers. Will they finally use him? It is a good matchup. Hopefully, we actually see him getting involved. Cole Kmet against Carolina, always scoring upside, but it's hard to really trust him or anyone below this. Kate Otten was someone I really liked going into this week, and he had an okay game. Tyler Conklin finally getting some targets and some proper route numbers the last couple of weeks. So I feel like he could be solid. Everyone below that is a risk. Mike Gesicki against the Ravens, he does get used more when they're losing. So that's why I've got him a lot higher than Eric All Jr. All still getting a lot of targets when he's out there, but I do feel like Gesicki is still the main guy there. Likely and Andrews, I mean, that's just crazy. They're just not involved at all. Mark Andrews, I don't understand what they're doing, but he has had 15 routes total the last 2 weeks for 2 targets. Could this be another situation? It seems to be happening like that when they're in closer games where they're winning against good teams. So when I say closer, I mean games against better teams, not necessarily close by scoreline, because it wasn't that close last week. I don't trust Andrews. I don't trust Likely. Schultz was someone I was hoping would emerge. He's got a tough-ish matchup, and he's not getting the targets with Dell back, so I need to see it happen before I can rank him higher. Same thing with Henry. Had that one breakout week, but you can't trust him. Nobody else there particularly of interest at the moment. Tommy Tremble is emerging. He's playing a lot more snaps and getting targets, but I don't really trust that. Noah Fan had a good amount of routes last week because they played like 90 snaps, but he actually was off the field a lot with Pharaoh Brown and AJ Barner involved. So Fant moves down for me. I'm not trusting him anymore. I thought he was going to be the every down guy, but we're returning to that situation we had last season where he was splitting with Colby Parkinson and Will Disley. I think that's starting to happen again, even though it's a new coaching staff, which is really frustrating. And that's all we've got for our start sits for week 5. If you've got tight end and kicker and DST questions or queries, go to the website ffdfantasyfootball.com. I've got my kicker and DST rankings up there. I'm currently the most accurate DST ranker in the world on Fantasy Pros, not just in Australia, obviously. That would not be much of a flex. On Fantasy Pros, for whatever reason, don't know what's happening this season, but it's happening like that with DSTs for me, apparently. A couple of years ago it was kickers. Apparently now I'm a DST guy. Of course, you can also check out all of my other rankings there as well. If you've got questions or you just want to see the visual graphics of my rankings and any other news I have out there, follow me on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. You can also like and follow this video. That would be fantastic. Really good way to support the channel and help us keep doing what we do. And finally, my articles are all at football.rasball.com. As I said, I'll be on the Walter Football After Dark podcast or video, I should say, on YouTube on your Saturday night, early Sunday morning. So feel free to hop on there and ask me some questions live. Happy to help you out there as well. Or you can always just message me over those platforms. I look forward to hearing from you guys, and good luck for week 5 in your fantasy leagues.